The sky was a wonderful deep blue with not a single cloud when Ethan Turner, a 14-year-old boy, left school with a backpack full of books and a head full of thoughts. He walked along the sidewalk, listening to the sound of his sneakers hitting the cracked asphalt while the gentle wind caressed his face. It was an ordinary afternoon for most people, but not for Ethan. On the outside, he seemed like just any other teenager, but inside, he carried a burden that few his age knew. Since his father died 3 years ago, he and his mother, Sarah, had been struggling to keep the bills paid and the house standing. Every day was a battle, but Sarah always smiled as if the world wasn't crumbling around them, and that smile was what kept Ethan moving forward, determined to help in any way he could. As he walked, his thoughts wandered to the school trip that was coming up soon. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, a trip to Washington, D.C., where he could visit the Capitol and the Lincoln Memorial, places he had only known from history books. But there was one obstacle: the money. His mother simply couldn't afford it. That's why Ethan had taken a job delivering newspapers every afternoon. He would do anything not to be the boy left behind, while all his friends embarked on that adventure. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the gate of Cliffside News, the old newspaper company where he worked. The place had a worn-out look, with old bricks and windows that creaked in the wind. Ethan smiled. It was a humble sight, but for him, it represented something bigger: the possibility of reaching his dreams. Every dollar he earned there was one step closer to the trip. As he entered the building, Julie, the receptionist, waved at him with her warm smile. She was always there, taking care of things, like a second mother to all the young workers.
Hi, Ethan. All set for today?
As always.
Ethan responded with a nod. He headed to the back of the office, where he grabbed his bundle of newspapers, already mapping out the route he would take that afternoon. The work wasn't easy, but it was simple, and it was his path to his dream. As he made his deliveries, his gaze drifted over the houses he passed, imagining what it would be like to live in some of them. And there, in the middle of his route, he stumbled upon something that would change the course of his life forever. On the sidewalk, in the shade of a leafy tree, was a small, dark object, a wallet. Ethan's heart raced as he bent down to pick it up. It looked expensive, made of high-quality leather. He looked around, searching for any sign of the owner, but the street was deserted. He carefully opened the wallet, and what he saw made his stomach turn. There was a substantial amount of money, several $100 bills, along with credit cards and a driver's license. The name on the driver's license was William Hayes, and something about that name sounded familiar. Ethan stood there, the weight of the wallet in his hands. His heart wrestled with his mind. This money could change everything. He could finally pay for the trip, buy some new clothes for his mother, and even help with the household bills. But at the same time, guilt had already crept into his conscience. He knew he couldn't keep what wasn't his. His father always told him, "A man's integrity is worth more than any fortune." Ethan closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He already knew what he had to do. He put the wallet in his backpack and continued his route, but now his thoughts were distant, heavy as lead. The last house on his delivery route was on a street he avoided whenever he could. It was where William Hayes lived, in a colossal mansion surrounded by tall iron gates. William Hayes wasn't just a rich man. He was a local legend, an eccentric millionaire. No one had seen him in public for years. They said he had made his fortune in shady deals, and the stories about him ranged from the reclusive genius of investments to the bitter loner who had driven away everyone who loved him. Ethan had always heard the rumors from afar. Some said he was cruel and heartless. Others believed he had lost something irreplaceable and had hidden from the world because of it. But regardless of the story, what everyone knew was that he was untouchable. As he approached the gates of the mansion, Ethan felt the weight of what he was about to do. There was a part of him that wanted to turn back, pretend he had never found the wallet. But when he thought of his mother and what she would expect of him, Ethan knew he couldn't run away. He took a deep breath and pressed the doorbell, the sound echoing through the silent property. Time seemed to drag on until finally, the creaking of doors was heard, followed by heavy footsteps. The large wooden door slowly opened, revealing a woman with a stern expression and impeccable uniform. The tall housekeeper, her hair tied back, asked in a firm but not rude voice,
"May I help you?"
Intimidated, Ethan responded in a trembling voice.
Could I speak with Mr. William, please?
"Who are you?"
Asked the housekeeper.
My name is Ethan. I have something I believe belongs to Mr. William.
She examined him briefly before nodding.
"Wait here."
A few minutes later, Mr. William came to the door. The man was even more imposing than Ethan had imagined. Tall, with graying hair and a thick beard, his eyes were an icy blue, as cold as the first winter snowfall. He looked at Ethan with a mixture of surprise and suspicion.
Yes?
William asked, his voice deep like distant thunder. Ethan swallowed hard.
I found your wallet. It was on the ground near my delivery route. I thought you would want it back.
There was a silence that seemed to stretch on forever. William looked at the wallet, then at Ethan, and then back at the wallet. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but carried something Ethan couldn't quite identify.
You could have kept this. No one would have known.
Ethan, even feeling the weight of the question, simply shook his head.
It wouldn't be right.
William let out a brief but joyless laugh.
You're an honest boy, aren't you? Something rare these days.
He took the wallet from Ethan's hand, his eyes remaining fixed on the boy for a long and intense moment.
Come in.
Surprised, Ethan hesitated, but there was something in the way William invited him that made him feel that refusing would be a mistake. He stepped through the gate, feeling the air shift as if he were entering another world. The house was grand but devoid of life. The expensive, antique furniture was scattered almost carelessly, and the silence was absolute, except for the distant ticking of a clock marking time. William led Ethan into a spacious room where he sat in a worn leather chair.
Sit down, boy. I want to know more about you.
And so it began, an unexpected invitation, a conversation that felt more like an interview. William wanted to know everything. Where Ethan came from, why he was working, what he dreamed of doing with his life. And with each answer Ethan gave, William seemed more intrigued. Little by little, what started as a superficial conversation turned into something deeper. Ethan spoke about his father, about how he and his mother struggled to survive. And surprisingly, William spoke about his own life, a life of solitude and loss, of financial successes that couldn't fill the growing void in his heart. The hours passed, and when Ethan finally stood up to leave, William stopped him with one last sentence that would echo in the boy's mind for days to come.
Come back tomorrow. I have a proposal for you.
The morning sun had barely risen over the horizon when Ethan woke up, his mind restless from the conversation the day before. He thought over and over about William Hayes's unexpected invitation and what the proposal he mentioned could mean. The stories about the reclusive man always painted him as cold and unreachable. And yet, here was Ethan being invited to return. As he walked toward the mansion, the morning breeze carried the scent of damp grass and freshly bloomed flowers, but the natural beauty around him barely registered in his mind. His thoughts were focused on one thing. What did William Hayes want with him? Upon arriving, Ethan hesitated in front of the iron gate, an imposing structure that seemed to separate the ordinary world from the luxurious, isolated life of William. His hands trembled as he pressed the doorbell, the sound echoing across the vastness of the property. Once again, the housekeeper answered.
"May I help you?"
Mr. William asked me to come back today.
Ethan replied, feeling small in the grandness of the place and the woman's impassive demeanor. With a slight, discreet smile, she said,
"Wait here."
As the housekeeper walked away to call Mr. William, Ethan felt the weight of being in an environment so distant from his reality. That house, so grand and solitary, seemed to be in mourning for something invisible. Moments later, the main door opened again, and Mr. William appeared, this time with a lighter expression, as if he had spent the night reflecting on something important.
Come in, Ethan.
He said, his tone still deep but somehow welcoming. Ethan followed him to the large room where they had spoken the day before. The vast and empty space seemed even larger in the daylight, as if the luxury of yesteryear had been slowly consumed by the dust of time.
I've been thinking
William began, settling into a worn leather armchair.
about what you said yesterday, about your mother, your struggle, and your desire to do the right thing.
Ethan remained silent, curious to see where this would lead.
Honesty and integrity are rare commodities, especially in a world where everyone seems willing to sell themselves for the right price. You could have kept that wallet, and yet you brought it back. And that makes me think that perhaps you're different.
I just did what was right.
Ethan replied with a sincerity typical of his age. William looked at him for a long moment before getting up. He walked over to a shelf filled with books and picked up an old photo album. As he opened the album, he revealed old photos, most of them of a smiling, elegant woman standing beside a younger William.
This was my wife, Elizabeth. She passed away a few years ago, and since then, things have never been the same.
Ethan didn't know what to say, but he felt a pang in his chest when he saw the gleam of sadness in William's eyes. There was something deeply human about that man, hidden under layers of distance and mystery.
She believed that money only has value when it's used for something bigger than ourselves.
William continued, turning another page of the album, which showed photos of charity events and philanthropic projects the couple had supported.
But after she was gone, I lost myself. I closed off. I stopped seeing the world through the eyes she helped me see it with.
I'm sorry.
Ethan said, his voice low. He didn't know how to relate to William's pain, but he recognized the feeling of loss. William closed the album, the sound of the leather cover echoing through the silent room.
I called you here today because I want to do something different. I want to try to see the world the way Elizabeth did, and I believe that perhaps you can help me with that.
Ethan blinked, surprised.
Me? How could I help?
You have something that many here have lost: hope and determination, even when things seem impossible. You work hard to achieve your dreams, and that's why I want to offer you an opportunity.
William then explained his proposal. He wanted Ethan to help him with a project, something that wasn't just about business, but about reviving community spirit and helping those in difficult situations. He talked about creating a scholarship fund, improving local schools, and even revitalizing abandoned areas in the city. And to start, he wanted Ethan to be the first beneficiary. Ethan listened in silence, absorbing every word, but his mind was in a whirlwind. He had never expected anything like this. The idea of working alongside a millionaire to help the city and at the same time, receiving a scholarship to fulfill his dreams seemed too surreal to be true.
That sounds incredible.
Ethan said, his voice almost trembling.
But why me? Why choose me for this?
William looked directly at him, his blue eyes gleaming with something Ethan couldn't fully identify.
Because you remind me of someone I once was, and you also remind me of who I should have been.
The words echoed in Ethan's mind as he absorbed the weight of the responsibility being placed in his hands. It was a new path, full of uncertainties but also hope. And at that moment, he realized that he was standing before something much greater than anything he had ever imagined. The first step of a journey that would change his life and the lives of many others had been taken. The weeks that followed Ethan's first meeting with Mr. William passed in a blur of emotions and responsibilities. Ethan could hardly believe what was happening. He, an ordinary boy, was now involved in a project that seemed too big for his hands. Mr. William, in his position of power and wealth, had given Ethan the chance to participate in something that could transform the city and the young boy's own life. Ethan soon realized that this opportunity carried a weight he had not anticipated. Mr. William was not an easy man to deal with. Although the initial invitation had been marked by a tone of openness, there was an intensity in the millionaire that made Ethan feel like he was always on the verge of making a mistake. However, the boy was not alone. The housekeeper, Martha, began to play a more significant role in Ethan's life. Martha, who had been with Mr. William for more than 2 decades, knew his moods and habits better than anyone else. She helped Ethan understand Mr. William's deep silences and the subtext of his words.
He's a man of few words, but many thoughts.
Martha said one afternoon as she prepared tea for Ethan.
Often, what he doesn't say carries the most meaning.
Ethan listened intently, absorbing every piece of advice Martha gave him. He knew he had to learn quickly if he wanted to handle Mr. William. During one of his visits, as he entered the grand library of the mansion, he found the millionaire hunched over a map of the city, his cold yet attentive eyes studying every detail.
What do you know about this city, Ethan?
Mr. William asked without raising his eyes from the map. Ethan remained silent for a moment, trying to find the right words.
I know it's a city that struggles. Many places are abandoned, schools need help, and sometimes it feels like people have lost hope.
Mr. William nodded slowly, finally lifting his gaze to meet Ethan's.
Correct. And that is why we are here. What you don't know, however, is that many years ago, I tried to help this city, but I failed. And now, with your help, we will try again.
Those words, with your help, echoed in Ethan's mind. Although he was still young, he knew he was being treated as an equal by Mr. William. This filled him with pride, but also fear. He didn't want to fail. Ethan's first major challenge came when Mr. William tasked him with leading a small team in the oldest neighborhood of the city. It was an area neglected for years, with abandoned buildings, pothole-filled streets, and little hope. The goal was to start there, revitalizing a public school that served hundreds of children but was in dire condition. Mr. William gave Ethan the responsibility of organizing a cleanup and repair effort at the school, something the boy had never done before. "Consider this your first test," Mr. William said.
I want to see how you handle real responsibilities.
Ethan accepted the challenge, but as the days leading up to the cleanup approached, he felt the pressure mounting. He did what he could, visited the school, spoke with the directors, organized supply lists, and tried to rally volunteers. But the more he tried, the more things seemed to spiral out of control. Volunteers canceled at the last minute, supplies didn't arrive on time, and on the day of the event, it seemed like everything was destined to fail. On the morning of the cleanup, Ethan arrived at the school and was met with a disheartening scene. Only a few people had shown up, and the building was in even worse condition than he remembered. He looked at the peeling walls, the overgrown soccer field, and the empty hallways. The fear of failure consumed him, and he felt like he was letting Mr. William down. It was then that Martha appeared, with her calm yet firm demeanor.
Challenges like this are common when you're starting out, Ethan. The important thing is not to give up. People need to see that you believe in what you're doing. Only then will they believe as well.
Martha's words ignited a spark in Ethan. He took a deep breath and, instead of being discouraged by the lack of people, decided to focus on those who were there. He gathered the small group of volunteers and motivated them to start, even if they were few. Over time, more people began to show up. First, it was the neighbors, curious about the movement. Then, other volunteers who had canceled decided to show up after all. By the end of the day, the school wasn't perfect, but the field had been cleared. The walls had received a fresh coat of paint, and the playground was starting to take shape again. More than that, Ethan felt that something had changed. The people around him were smiling, excited to be part of something bigger, and though he was exhausted, he felt he had taken the first step in the right direction. When he returned to the mansion that night, covered in paint and dust, Mr. William was waiting for him in the library.
So?
He asked, raising an eyebrow. Ethan, with a mix of pride and humility, reported what had happened. He spoke about the difficulties, the mistakes, but also about how things started to come together when he decided to push forward despite the setbacks. Mr. William listened in silence, his expression unreadable but attentive. When Ethan finished, the millionaire stood from his chair and walked over to him, pausing for a moment before placing a firm hand on the boy's shoulder.
You did well, Ethan. Leadership isn't about never failing. It's about how you rise after failure.
Those words made Ethan reflect. He felt that something had shifted that night. He had faced his first major challenge, and though it hadn't been perfect, he had learned that true success lies in perseverance. The relationship between Ethan and Mr. William also began to change. The millionaire, once reserved and distant, seemed more open, as if he was beginning to trust Ethan not just as a promising boy, but as a partner in his journey of transformation. However, that trust came with a price. The challenges would only grow from here. And so, Ethan continued his journey, increasingly immersed in the complex and challenging world of Mr. William, and more aware that his role was crucial not only for the city's future, but for William's own future as well. As the project gained momentum, Ethan felt that something inside him was growing as well. Mr. William entrusted him with more responsibilities, and the small successes of the past only encouraged him to move forward. He was no longer just a boy with distant dreams. He was making a difference, leading and inspiring others to join the cause. The oldest neighborhood in the city was beginning to transform, brick by brick, and little by little, what was once neglected was coming back to life. But like any great journey, soon there would be a moment of downfall, a test greater than all others, which would put everything Ethan had built at risk. It was on a cloudy afternoon that things began to fall apart. Mr. William had organized a major fundraising event, a charity gala to be held in one of the renovated buildings. Ethan had been tasked with coordinating the most important details, ensuring that everything was ready, that the donors were comfortable, and above all, that the event was a success. This event wasn't just about money. It was about proving that the revitalization project was viable, that it had a real impact. On the morning of the event, Ethan was everywhere at once. He made sure the tables were arranged, the decorations were in place, and the invitations had been sent out. But as the hours passed, small problems began to surface. The catering team was late, the flower arrangements were wrong, and some of the most important people on the guest list started canceling at the last minute. Tension grew like a tight knot in Ethan's stomach, but he tried to remain calm. Martha, who always seemed to know what to do, gently reminded him,
These things happen. What matters is how you respond to them.
With those words, Ethan tried to focus on solutions, but it seemed that the more he tried to fix things, the more they slipped out of his hands. The volunteer team was exhausted. The flowers remained wrong, and the guests who arrived noticed the confusion. In the midst of this storm, Mr. William arrived. With his impeccable suit and sharp gaze, he entered the hall and immediately sensed the tension in the air. His eyes met Ethan's, who was trying to coordinate several tasks at once. It was impossible to hide the chaos, and Mr. William knew it.
Ethan,
He said with a firm voice.
what's going on?
Ethan tried to explain, speaking quickly about the unforeseen problems, the last-minute cancellations, and how everything seemed out of control. But as he spoke, he saw the growing disappointment in Mr. William's eyes. The man who had once trusted him so much now looked at him with a mixture of frustration and disappointment.
I trusted you to lead this, and this is a disaster.
The words hit Ethan like a punch to the stomach. He knew things weren't going well, but hearing that from Mr. William himself was devastating. The millionaire turned away, clearly dissatisfied, and left Ethan alone in the middle of the hall, surrounded by chaos and unmet expectations. Ethan felt the weight of failure like never before. He had tried, really tried, but everything seemed out of control. Feeling crushed by pressure and failure, he left the hall and went to a secluded area at the back of the building. He needed air. He needed to think. For a few minutes he stood there, taking deep breaths, trying to gather his thoughts. Mr. Williams' words echoed in his mind.
I trusted you.
Ethan had always wanted to do the right thing, always wanted to prove he was capable. But now all he felt was that he had let down the person who had given him the biggest chance of his life. It was then that Martha found him. She approached silently, but her gaze was full of compassion. She didn't say anything for a moment, just stood beside him, letting the silence speak for itself.
Sometimes,
She finally began,
things don't go as planned, no matter how hard we try. But that doesn't mean you failed. This would be hard for anyone, especially you, who are just a kid. Don't be hard on yourself.
Ethan shook his head, unable to look Martha in the eye.
But I did fail. Everything Mr. William wanted, I ruined. He trusted me and I just couldn't do it.
Martha sighed and placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder.
Mr. William can be harsh, but he knows that failures are part of the path. What matters isn't what went wrong, but what you'll do next. And I know that he knows that too.
Ethan, however, wasn't convinced. The weight of failure still crushed him, and he felt he had lost something more important than the success of an event. He had lost Mr. Williams' trust. That night, while the event continued in a disorganized manner, Ethan left early. He couldn't bear to see the judging looks from the guests or the disappointment on Mr. Williams' face. He returned home feeling defeated, as if the journey had ended prematurely. But like any hero on a journey, it was in the fall that he would find true strength. The next morning, Ethan woke up with a plan. It wasn't time to give up. He knew he had made mistakes, but he also knew he could fix them. He decided to face Mr. William and take full responsibility for everything, with no excuses. When he arrived at the mansion, it was Martha who greeted him at the door.
He's waiting for you,
she said with a slight, encouraging smile. Ethan walked to the library, where Mr. William always spent his mornings, the room heavy with the soft sound of the crackling fireplace. The millionaire was seated, but this time his expression was indecipherable.
Mr. William,
Ethan began, his voice firm but sincere.
I know the event was a disaster, and I know it's my fault. I made mistakes, but I'm not here to make excuses. I'm here to learn from it and make things right.
Mr. William remained silent for a moment, his eyes studying Ethan.
And what have you learned?
Ethan took a deep breath.
That leading isn't just about giving orders or making plans. It's about how you react when everything goes wrong. It's about taking care of the people around you, and I failed at that. But I'm ready to try again if you still trust me.
For a moment, silence reigned. Then Mr. Williams stood up, walking to the window overlooking the vast, solitary gardens of the mansion.
Ethan,
He finally said,
trust isn't something that's lost with a single failure. It's something built over time. And as difficult as it was to see that event fall apart, the real failure would be giving up now.
Ethan's heart raced. He hadn't expected such a response.
You have what it takes, but you still have much to learn, and so do I.
With those words, something changed. It wasn't just the beginning of a new attempt. It was the beginning of a true partnership, where Mr. Williams saw in Ethan not just an apprentice, but someone who could also teach him something. And so, after the fall, Ethan rose stronger. He had faced his greatest fear, failure, and emerged on the other side with more determination than ever. Now the real challenge lay ahead, and he knew he would have to be stronger, wiser, and more resilient than he had ever been. The cold winter wind blew strongly as Ethan approached the renovated school, his coat fluttering around his body. It was the same school that, months earlier, was on the verge of abandonment. Now its freshly painted walls gleamed under the dim morning light, and the soccer field, once overgrown, was ready to be used again. The revitalization project that he and Mr. William had envisioned was finally taking shape. But this wasn't just an ordinary day. Today, Ethan and Mr. William would present the project's major progress to the community. The school would be reopened, a symbol of hope and renewal for a city that had long been forgotten. The event wasn't just a celebration of hard work. It was a statement that the impossible could be achieved when people believed in a greater good. Ethan entered the school and saw Mr. William standing by one of the large windows, watching the first volunteers arrive. Unlike before, Mr. William no longer seemed like the bitter and distant man Ethan had met. There was something different about him now. A spark in his eyes, a softness in his facial features.
Are you ready, Ethan?
Mr. William asked, without taking his eyes off the view outside. Ethan nodded.
Yes, I am. And you?
Mr. Williams smiled slightly, something rare until then.
I never thought I'd say this, but yes, I am ready.
The school was beginning to fill with life. Parents, children, teachers, and community members entered the auditorium, where chairs were arranged in rows for the reopening ceremony. The air was thick with anticipation. As Ethan watched the scene, he felt a wave of emotions. He had started this journey as a boy trying to do the right thing, but now it was more than that. He had become part of something bigger, something he knew deep down could change many lives. The housekeeper, Martha, approached and placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder.
You did it, my dear. I never doubted you would.
Ethan smiled at her, thanking her silently. Martha, with her calm wisdom and constant support, had been an anchor during the toughest moments. Now, she looked at him with genuine pride, as if she were watching her own son achieve something extraordinary. But like every great journey, there was still one last obstacle to overcome. In the middle of the preparations, one of the press coordinators approached with a worried expression.
Ethan, Mr. William, there are some rumors that certain community members are skeptical about the use of funds for this project. Some believe the money could have been used in a different way. They're questioning Mr. Williams' intentions.
Ethan stood in silence for a moment, absorbing the information. He knew that despite all the work, there was still mistrust regarding Mr. William. The millionaire's past was shrouded in mystery, and his previously reclusive actions left many with doubts about his true motivations. Knowing that this could ruin everything, Ethan walked over to Mr. William, who was still near the window, watching the movements outside.
We have a problem. Some people are questioning the use of funds. They think there may be ulterior motives.
Mr. William remained silent for a few seconds, his face closing into an expression of deep thought. Ethan knew this was the critical moment. If they didn't do something to change the narrative, all the work they had done could be undone.
Let me handle this,
Mr. Williams said, his voice low but firm. He turned and walked toward the stage where the ceremony was about to begin. Ethan followed, his heart racing. The auditorium was full. People murmured, looked around, some smiling, others with expressions of uncertainty. When Mr. Williams stepped onto the stage, silence fell over the crowd. Everyone was eager to hear what the millionaire had to say. Mr. William began slowly, his deep voice echoing through the auditorium.
When we started this project, many of you knew me only as a rich, reclusive man, perhaps even selfish. And the truth is, for many years, I was all of that. After the death of my wife, Elizabeth, I shut myself off from the world. I believed that money was the only thing left for me, and that the rest, people, the community, didn't matter anymore.
Mr. Williams' words hung in the air like a weight, and Ethan watched the crowd closely. Some seemed surprised by his frankness, others still skeptical. But then something changed in Mr. Williams' expression.
But then a 14-year-old boy found my wallet, and he did something that many wouldn't. He returned it, without asking for anything in return, without thinking of himself. And at that moment, I realized that perhaps the world still had something to teach me.
The silence in the auditorium was absolute. Ethan's eyes filled with tears as Mr. William continued.
Ethan Turner showed me that integrity and kindness still exist, even when everything seems lost. It was he who made me realize that money on its own is empty. But when used for good, it can become a powerful force for change. He not only saved this project, he saved me as well.
The audience was moved. Some people discreetly wiped away tears. Others smiled, clearly touched by Mr. Williams' words. But the transformation was complete. The distrust had disappeared, replaced by admiration and respect.
I know many of you still have doubts, but I am here to assure you that every penny of this project will be used for the good of our community. And I promise you, this is just the beginning.
When Mr. William finished speaking, the auditorium erupted in applause. Ethan couldn't hold back the smile that spread across his face. Mr. William stepped down from the stage and walked over to him, extending his hand.
You've taught me a lot, Ethan. Never forget that.
Ethan shook Mr. Williams' hand, feeling proud of everything that had happened. In the days that followed, the city began to see the fruits of Ethan and Mr. Williams' work. The revitalization project gained popular support, and more areas began to be transformed. But for Ethan, the real triumph wasn't just in the renovated buildings or the reopened schools. It was in the transformation of Mr. William, the man who had once been reclusive and bitter, now a community leader guided by newfound hope. And as for Ethan, on the same day of the school's inauguration, as the last rays of the sun touched the newly cleaned windows, Mr. William approached Ethan. Without much ado, he called him aside and looked him in the eye with a softer expression than usual.
Ethan, I'm not the kind of man who gives grand speeches, but I need to thank you for everything. You brought more than your integrity to this project. You brought life back to places I thought were dead.
Ethan remained silent, absorbing the words of a man he had come to admire. Before he could respond, Mr. William continued,
As a thank you, I want to do something for you. I know how much you dreamed of that trip to Washington, and I've already taken care of everything. You'll be going on that trip.
Ethan was stunned. His heart raced, and his eyes sparkled with surprise. He had set that dream aside, thinking he'd never have the opportunity, and now he stood before one of the greatest achievements of his life.
Really? Are you serious?
Ethan could barely contain his excitement. Mr. William simply nodded with a discreet smile.
Consider it a small thank you for everything you've done.
Ethan stood there speechless, but with a feeling of gratitude so strong he could hardly breathe. He knew that gesture meant much more than the trip itself. It was a symbol of the trust and friendship they had built over the months. After the trip to Washington, which was everything Ethan had dreamed of and more, he and Mr. William continued to meet regularly. The boy would go to the mansion on weekends, where they spent hours sharing stories about the past, the challenges they had faced, and even their dreams for the future. Mr. William, who had once isolated himself from the world, found in Ethan a genuine friendship. He shared stories about his late wife and about the times when he still believed in the power to change the world. Ethan, in turn, spoke of his ambitions and his desire to continue helping the community. Their meetings became an important part of Ethan's routine. Between conversations in the grand library and walks through the carefully restored gardens, they created a deep bond. It was more than a mentor-student relationship. It was a sincere friendship based on mutual respect and the desire to build something better together. And so, what began with a simple act of honesty transformed into a partnership that would change not only the lives of Ethan and Mr. William, but also those around them. They proved that true wealth lies in the connections we make and the lives we impact. And for Ethan, the journey was just beginning, knowing he had helped create something greater than he could ever have imagined. Now tell me, what did you feel? Would you do the same as Mr. William? Don't forget to subscribe to follow more stories to feel.